On August 20th, 2008, a tragic accident occurred when a Spanish passenger jet crashed shortly after taking off from Madrid-Barajas Airport, resulting in the deaths of 154 people on board. At first glance, the cause seems straightforward, but a closer look reveals a story filled with unexpected twists and tragic coincidences. This crash was on the brink of being avoided altogether. This isn't a story about a plane catching fire or hitting a mountain in the dark. Instead, it's about a crash that almost never happened. Let's delve into the story of Spanair Flight 5022. On that August afternoon, 166 passengers and 6 crew members boarded Spanair Flight 5022, heading to Gran Canaria in the Canary Islands, a 3-hour flight. While most passengers were Spanish, there were also a few from Germany, France, Turkey, Italy, and other countries. Many were holidaymakers eager to escape the summer heat of Madrid. The captain of the flight was 39-year-old Antonio Garcia Luna. With over 8,000 flying hours, he was a seasoned pilot. Before joining Spanair in 1999, he served in Spain's Air Force as a flight instructor and test pilot. By 2006, he had become a captain on the MD-80 aircraft. Although his training notes pointed out areas for improvement, especially in crew coordination, he was generally seen as a skilled and meticulous pilot. The first officer, Francisco Javier Mulet, was 31 years old and had joined Spanair the previous year. With just 220 flying hours when he was hired, he had gained over 1,200 hours of flying experience by the time of the accident. Colleagues described him as serious and disciplined, someone who was enthusiastic about flying and eager to do his job well. The plane itself was a 15-year-old McDonnell Douglas MD-82. Though it is now mostly retired, this model was once popular and considered very safe. What makes this accident particularly tragic is how close it came to being avoided. Just before 1:30 in the afternoon, the pilots of Spanair Flight 5022 informed the tower controller that they were ready to take off from runway 36 left. The controller gave them the go-ahead, but moments later, the pilots reported a problem and requested to exit the runway. The controller approved their request, and the pilots contacted the Maintenance Control Center in Palma. They had noticed an unusually high reading from the RAM air temperature probe. This probe measures the temperature of the air hitting the aircraft's surface. As a plane moves through the air, it compresses and heats up the air in front of it. At high speeds, this temperature increase can be quite significant. Planes need to measure this temperature for 2 main reasons. First, it helps pilots decide whether to turn on the anti-icing system. If it's freezing outside, but the air in front of the plane is warmer, the wings will stay above freezing and won't need anti-icing. Second, the temperature reading helps control the autopilot and engine throttles. A high temperature reading indicates the plane is moving fast, which means the engine power needs to be reduced to prevent damage. If the RAT probe is faulty, the autopilot can't properly adjust the engine power during takeoff. Therefore, the pilots decided it was safer to return to the gate for inspection. Ironically, the RAT probe has its own heating element to prevent it from freezing. When the plane is on the ground, this heating can cause the sensor to show falsely high temperatures. The captain called the maintenance center using his mobile phone, and they suggested resetting the Z29 circuit breaker, which powers the RAT probe's heater. The pilots followed the advice, but the probe's temperature didn't decrease. They brought the plane back to the gate for a thorough inspection. The cockpit was busy with crew members, maintenance technicians, and other personnel discussing solutions, and even considering using dry ice to cool the probe. During this time, the captain noted the significant delay and made sure to document everything that happened. Pressure was mounting inside the cockpit as the crew worked to get the plane back on the runway quickly. With the outside temperature at 30 degrees Celsius and the cabin unable to cool properly, both passengers and crew grew increasingly anxious. Engineers had spent over an hour trying to fix the faulty sensor and finally suggested disconnecting the electrical supply to the RAT probe heater by pulling the circuit breaker. The captain agreed, and preparations for departure began. A Spanair flight attendant, seated behind the pilots, was discussing the sensor issue with the first officer. As the plane was being refueled, the captain left the aircraft to oversee the process and ensure it was completed swiftly. Since the plane had returned to the gate and shut down its engines, the pilots had to restart the entire flight process. They needed to request clearance to fly to Las Palmas. The first officer mistakenly called the wrong controller because they hadn't reset the radio frequency from the previous flight. This mistake highlighted the rushed and disorganized atmosphere in the cockpit. In high-pressure situations like this, sticking to procedures is crucial. The cockpit voice recorder shows the captain felt pressed for time during the before-start checklist. He often anticipated the first officer's checklist items and responded before they were read aloud. The captain even took over the radio communication, a task assigned to the first officer. After starting the engines, the crew began the after-start checklist. They read through 8 items, but when they reached the final item about setting flaps and slats, the captain interrupted to have the first officer request taxi permission from ATC. They started the engines, but never completed the final checklist item. While taxiing to the runway, the pilots went through the taxi checklist, which included checking the light for the automatic reserve thrust system. This light should be on if additional thrust is available in case of an engine failure. However, the light was off, and the pilots didn't notice. They also missed a chance to check the flap settings. The takeoff briefing, which reviews takeoff speeds, thrust, and flaps, was not completed. During taxi, the pilots were also conversing with the flight attendant about non-essential matters. Confusingly, as the aircraft aligned with the runway, the first officer conducted a final check, known as the Takeoff Imminent Checklist. He noted flaps 11, despite the fact that the flaps were actually set to 0. Investigators later concluded that this discrepancy was due to expectation bias, where the pilot's expectation influenced their perception. The first officer expected the flaps to be in the positions he mentioned, without checking his instruments to confirm. This phenomenon, known as expectation bias, occurs when people see only what they expect to see. It's more common under stressful conditions, like the time pressure and heavy workload the pilots faced. The captain was supposed to oversee the first officer's checks, but since he was focused on lining up the plane on the runway, his attention was directed outside. At this point, there was only one last chance to prevent a disaster: the takeoff warning system. This system is designed to sound an alarm if pilots attempt takeoff without configuring the plane correctly, such as not setting the flaps. For reasons we will explore later, this alarm did not go off. The takeoff seemed normal, and as the plane reached 157 knots, the first officer lifted off the ground. However, once airborne, the stall warning horn and stick shaker activated. The aircraft banked 32 degrees to the right and struggled to climb, only reaching 40 feet above the runway. The first officer initially thought the engine had failed and reduced thrust, but then he pushed the throttles fully forward in an attempt to correct the issue. Despite these efforts, the plane began to descend. It struck the ground tail first, skidded along, crossed an embankment, and crashed into the opposite side, bursting into flames. In just over 10 seconds from liftoff, the plane exploded. Out of the 172 people on board, only 18 survived. This was the worst air accident in Spain in 25 years. An immediate investigation was launched by Spain's Civil Aviation Accident and Incident Investigation Commission. The failure to deploy the flaps was clearly identified as the main cause of the crash. But this issue is just the surface of a much deeper problem. When the crew turned back from the runway before their first takeoff attempt, the aircraft was still in a flyable condition. The high temperature reading from the RAT sensor had been seen on other flights without causing any issues. The crew's decision to return to the gate, meant to be cautious, ended up causing their own downfall. The delay and the heat made everyone stressed. Under this pressure, the crew rushed through their checklists, missed important steps, and didn't properly check the plane. They started to look without seeing, missing crucial problems. The roles of captain and first officer became mixed up, making it unclear who was responsible for what. Another ironic twist is that the takeoff warning system, which should have stopped the takeoff if the plane wasn't ready, might have failed due to the same problem that made them return to the gate, the RAT heating element. Both systems use the same electrical relay, which might have failed. Some reports suggest a link between the TOW's failure and the RAT problem, but after thorough testing, the investigation could not find a clear reason why the tows didn't work on this flight. Almost a year after the Spanair crash, a Spanair MD-87 preparing to fly from Palma de Mallorca to Barcelona had a high rat temperature reading while taxiing. The temperature gauge showed 99 degrees, the highest it could display. Remembering the previous year's crash, the crew decided to test the takeoff warning system and found it wasn't working. They checked that the plane was properly set up for takeoff and decided to fly to Barcelona after noting the issue in the maintenance log. Boeing reported that from 2000 to 2008, there were 6 cases of high rat temperatures combined with failed tows tests. In 4 of these cases, replacing the electrical relay, which powers both systems, resolved the problem. This suggests, but doesn't confirm, that the tows on Spanair Flight 5022 may have failed due to the same issue affecting the rat heating element. The exact cause of the failure remains unknown. The final report on the crash included several recommendations to prevent similar accidents. It suggested changing procedures for the MD-80 and similar aircraft so that the tows is tested before every flight. The report also recommended that the European Aviation Safety Agency and the FAA revise certification requirements so that the tows cannot be disabled by a single fault and provides a clear warning if it fails. Additionally, the report noted that if the first officer had kept the nose of the plane below 13 degrees, instead of pulling it up to 18 degrees during the stall, the plane might have safely climbed away from the runway. Therefore, it recommended that takeoff stall recovery be included in both initial and recurrent pilot training. Finally, the report emphasized improving crew resource management, a significant factor in the crash. It recommended that ESA ensure airline training programs stress the importance of a sterile cockpit, a distraction-free environment, and include examples of accidents where lack of a sterile cockpit was a contributing factor. Thank you for watching this deep dive into the tragic story of Spanair Flight 5022. We hope this video shed light on the complexities and lessons learned from this devastating event. If you found this video insightful, please consider subscribing to our channel for more detailed investigations into aviation incidents. Don't forget to leave a comment below with your thoughts or questions. We'd love to hear from you. Stay safe and see you in the next video.